In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Sony 85mm f1.8 and why it's my go-to lens for interviews and B-roll. Here's the story. The Sony 85mm f1.8 has a maximum aperture of f1.8 and a minimum aperture of f22. It has a 9-blade aperture diaphragm and a minimum focus distance of 80 centimeters. It also has a double linear autofocus motor, which makes the focusing fast and silent, which is really important for interviews. It has a filter thread size of 67mm, it weighs 1 kilo, it has no optical steady shot, it has an autofocus and manual focus switch, and also a focus hold button which can be assigned to other functions on the Sony FX6. All this for $750 Australian. Now the reason this lens is my go-to for interviews and B-roll is because I like the f1.8 maximum aperture. My normal go-to lens for the FX6 is the Sony 24-105mm f4, and that does a great job getting a lot of different types of shots, but it is limited to that f4 maximum aperture. With this lens having an f1.8 aperture, it really allows me to isolate my subject. So here's an example of an interview, and here's my subject, and I do believe the lens was set at f1.8. So you can see the separation between the subject and the background, and for me this is a really pleasing look and something that I like to have in my video projects. I also like using this lens for B-roll because it does, as I said before, isolate your subject and really highlight what you're trying to focus on. The biggest downside with this lens is there is no optical steady shot. So when you're using it with the Sony FX6, which doesn't have any IBIS built into it, it means you need to be either really steady when you're operating the camera or use some sort of support system like a cine saddle, a gimbal, or a tripod to really get those steady shots. But if you do go handheld, you might get a little bit of shake in your footage. So that is something to be aware of. And with this lens being 85mm, it is quite tight in some situations. So when I'm recording B-roll, I only put this lens on if I know I've got enough room to be able to step away from my subjects. If I'm in a tight space, then the 85mm lens might just be a little bit too tight for those kind of shots. That's when I'll probably opt for a wider lens like the 35mm f1.8, or I'll just use my versatile 24-105 f4 lens and get the shot that way. And here's a focus example using the Sony FX6 and the Sony 85mm f1.8. And these are the settings I've got the Sony FX6 set up to. The focus area is set to flexible spot, and this allows me to then touch on the screen where I want the focus to go. So if I select flexible spot for the focus area and then go into that, and then start touching the screen, the lens will then start focusing on whatever I touch on the screen, which is really handy. I didn't actually realize that we were able to do this on the FX6. I know you can do this on the A7S III quite easily, just touching the screen, but to be able to do it on the FX6, it seems you need to go into this setup. So if you didn't know that feature, hopefully that was helpful. And in this example, you can see there is a little bit of focus breathing, and hopefully this is a good enough example to determine whether it is acceptable for your video projects. I don't really like focus breathing, but for my projects, I think this is an acceptable amount of focus breathing. And the last thing I want to touch on with this lens is chromatic aberration. And there is a bit of chromatic aberration in this lens. Here's a photo example of the purple fringing that you can see around the cable. This is a very easy fix in Lightroom. However, in video, it's not as easy as far as I'm aware. So this is something to be aware of. Hopefully the video footage that I've shown in this video allows you to determine whether the chromatic aberration is a problem for you. I do know that the more expensive 85mm G Master lens that Sony does has less chromatic aberration. So that is one of the reasons that you do pay a premium for those G Master lenses. But overall, I'm really happy with this lens, and as I said, this is my go-to for interviews and B-roll, but if the space is just a little bit too tight, then I'd opt for my 35mm f1.8 Sony lens or the Sony 24-105 f4 lens as well. And I'll be doing a video on the Sony 24-105 f4 lens very soon, so look out for that. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos on video creation and the Sony FX6 in the future.